Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bookercast, the podcast where books come to life.
And I'm so excited to dive into another amazing story with all of you.
Whether you're a bookworm or just love a good story, this is the place for you.
Every episode, we explore incredible books, talk about their stories and characters, and share insights that'll make you fall in love with reading all over again.
All right, let's not keep you waiting any longer. Get comfortable, and let's jump right into it.
Sounds good.
All right, so we're diving into Why Nations Fail today, and this one really digs into global prosperity and poverty.
Yeah, it's a big one, but I think Why Nations Fail is fascinating because it asks us to really rethink development,
Okay.
not just geography or culture or even luck. It's about
Right.
institutions.
Okay, so institutions. So tell me a little bit more about that. What do they mean by institutions, and why are they so important?
Well, think of institutions as the rules of the game. In a society, it's how power is distributed, how economies function, and how we all interact, right? And Acemoglu and Robinson, they argue that the kind of institutions that a country has, that's what determines its fate. Like, are they inclusive or extractive?
So not just having them, but what they're like.
Exactly.
Okay, so can you give me like an example of how that works?
Absolutely. So the book opens with this really powerful example, the city of Nogales, which is literally divided by a fence. You have Nogales, Arizona in the U.S., and then Nogales, Sonora in Mexico.
Okay.
So,
What's so special about that?
well, on both sides, you have people who share a common heritage, culture, geography. They're in the same environment, but they have completely different realities.
Yeah.
Nogales, Arizona, higher standard of living, better health care, better education, all the signs of a prosperous society.
So you're saying that's not because of the people themselves, but because of the institutions on either side of that fence?
Exactly. It's like this powerful illustration of how an arbitrary border can have a massive impact because they represent different institutional frameworks, right?
Okay, I see where they're going with this.
Yeah.
So walk me through the two types of institutions, these inclusive versus extractive.
Right. So inclusive institutions, they try to create a level playing field so everyone has a chance to participate in the economy and the political process. So things like secure property rights, fair justice system, transparent regulations, open markets. So they empower a broad cross-section of society, encourage innovation, entrepreneurship.
So it's about giving power to more people and giving them the security and freedom to pursue their own goals.
Exactly. Now, contrast that with extractive institutions. These are designed to concentrate power and wealth in the hands of just a small elite so they can exploit everyone else for their own benefit.
Okay.
Things like corrupt regimes, rigged elections, elites controlling key resources, and no chance for social mobility.
So it's like a parasite where the elites are just sucking wealth out of everyone else.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And the book argues that those extractive institutions stifle innovation and limit economic growth because they create uncertainty, discourage investment, and undermine trust.
So basically what they're saying is inclusive institutions are the key to long-term prosperity, whereas extractive institutions lead to stagnation and poverty.
Yeah, that's the core argument. And they back it up with a ton of historical evidence from around the world in different time periods.
They didn't just make this up, right?
Oh, no, absolutely. These are serious academics, and they do a great job of debunking some common myths about why nations fail.
Okay. Like what?
Well, there's this idea that tropical countries are just doomed to poverty because of their geography or climate.
I heard that one. Something about the heat makes people lazy or something.
Exactly. And Acemoglu and Robinson just dismantled that theory. They point to tons of historical examples of flourishing civilizations in tropical regions, like the Mayan Empire, the Khmer Empire in Cambodia, even parts of India today.
So it's not about where you are on the map, it's about how your society is organized.
Exactly. And another one they tackle is what they call the ignorance hypothesis.
Okay, what's that?
It's this idea that leaders in poor countries simply don't know how to make their countries rich. Like, they just need some advice from some economists.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I could see why people think that, but I'm guessing they have a different take.
They do. They argue that most of the time, leaders know exactly what they're doing, and they choose policies that benefit them and their friends, even if it hurts the country.
Oh, so it's not about ignorance, it's about self-interest, and that these extractive institutions let them hold on to power and exploit the system.
You got it. And that leads to another important concept, the idea that institutions tend to stick around. They reinforce themselves over time.
So even if a country wants to change, it's not easy to get out of these patterns.
Exactly. It's like a path you're stuck on once you go down a certain road, inclusive or extractive. It's tough to change course.
So are they saying some countries are just stuck with bad institutions forever?
not necessarily. They say change is possible, but it usually takes some big disruption, what they call a critical juncture, to shake things up and create an opportunity for change.
Like some huge crisis or upheaval.
Exactly. Wars, revolutions, natural disasters, things that can really alter the balance of power and let new institutions emerge.
And these critical junctures don't always lead to good things, right? Things could get worse.
That's true. The outcome depends on a lot of things, what people do, the historical context, even chance. But the point is that these moments are key because that's when change is possible.
So history is not just a straight line. It's full of all these twists and turns.
Absolutely. And why nations fail really shows us how important it is to understand history if we want to understand why some countries succeed and others fail.
So we've been talking about how institutions, those rules of the game shape a nation's destiny, and so they tend to stick around.
Yeah, they do. And the book uses some really interesting historical examples to show this, going all the way back to ancient Rome.
Okay. Ancient Rome, an empire that lasted for centuries.
Hmm.
What can we learn from them about inclusive versus extractive institutions?
Well, they argue that Rome's rise and fall is like a warning sign. In the early days, Rome had a somewhat inclusive system. Citizens had a say in government. Property rights were pretty secure, and there was some social mobility. This helped them expand and succeed for centuries.
So you're saying that Rome's early success was partly due to these inclusive institutions?
Exactly. But as Rome got more powerful, the system became more and more extractive. Power went to the emperors and the elites. Corruption spread. Property rights weren't secure anymore, and innovation just stopped.
So what happened? Did this shift towards extractive institutions cause Rome to fall apart?
That's what they argue. Yeah, they see a clear link between the loss of inclusive institutions and the weakening of Rome, which eventually led to its collapse.
That's a pretty big lesson. Even the biggest empires can't escape the consequences of extractive institutions.
Exactly. And the book contrasts Rome's decline with the rise of another interesting example, Venice, in the late Middle Ages.
Venice, the city of canals and merchants, what made them different?
Venice had a unique system of governance that was surprisingly inclusive for a while. They had a council with people from different groups, a system of checks and balances to keep any one group from taking over.
So kind of like a early democracy.
Yeah, in a way. And this openness, along with secure property rights and a good legal system for merchants, it created a culture of entrepreneurship and innovation. Venice became a major trading power, famous for shipbuilding, glassmaking, all sorts of things.
So they did well because they had institutions that gave more people power and let them be part of the economy. Sounds familiar, but didn't Venice eventually decline too?
Yeah, they did. And that's where it gets interesting because it shows how fragile these inclusive institutions can be even when things are going well.
So what happened? Did they just become complacent?
Kind of, yeah. Venice's elite started to worry about the rising power of new merchants and craftsmen. They started a policy called the Serrata, which basically stopped new people from joining the ruling class.
So they became more extractive.
Exactly, and it was a disaster. Venice lost its energy, innovation slowed down, and they lost their edge.
Wow, so even a system as innovative as Venice's could fall victim to extractive practices. That's a scary thought.
It is, and it really highlights that to keep inclusive institutions, you need to be constantly vigilant and make sure that power doesn't end up in the hands of just a few.
Okay, so we've seen these patterns in ancient Rome and Renaissance Venice. What about more recently? How does this apply to the modern world?
Oh, the book goes into that too, looking at key moments like the Glorious Revolution in England in 1688.
What made the Glorious Revolution so important?
It was a big shift in power in England. It basically took power from the king and gave it to the parliament, which represented more of society, like merchants and landowners.
So a move towards more inclusive political institutions.
Exactly. And this had huge economic effects with a more accountable government and a focus on the rule of law. England's economy took off. It set the stage for the Industrial Revolution, which turned England into a global power.
So they're saying this shift towards inclusivity played a big role in England's rise.
Exactly. And they contrast England's story with other European countries like Spain and Austria-Hungary, which held on to those extractive systems where monarchs and elites had all the power, which often stopped innovation and entrepreneurship.
And those countries fell behind economically.
Exactly. Their extractive institutions made things uncertain, discouraged investment, and just held them back.
It's amazing how these patterns keep showing up. Inclusive institutions seem to create growth and progress, while extractive institutions, even if they have some success in the short term, lead to decline in the long run.
Yeah, that's a key takeaway, and it shows how important it is to understand these things if we want to understand the world today.
Okay, so we've talked about Rome, Venice, England. What about the rest of the world? How do these ideas apply to countries that were colonized or exploited by powerful countries?
That's a crucial question, and the book spends a lot of time looking at the impact of the slave trade and colonialism.
I can imagine those systems had a big effect on institutions.
They argue that the slave trade especially not only caused incredible suffering, but it really messed up the development of many African societies.
How so?
Well, the slave trade encouraged African leaders to do extractive things. They captured and sold their own people to European traders, which made them rich but destroyed social ties. And trust, it was a vicious cycle that kept those extractive institutions going and stopped economic development.
It's awful to think about the long-term effects of that exploitation. And what about colonialism? How did that change things?
Colonialism was complicated in some cases. European powers brought in some inclusive things like legal systems and infrastructure, but in a lot of cases, they just made existing extractive systems even worse.
So they were more interested in taking resources and staying in control than actually helping these places develop.
Yeah, a lot of the time. And they use the examples of British colonies like Sierra Leone and Australia to show this.
Okay, what was different about those two colonies?
Well, in Sierra Leone, the British basically took over the existing extractive systems. They gave power to local chiefs who helped them exploit the resources and people.
So they kept the cycle of extraction going.
Exactly. But in Australia, it was different. It started as a penal colony, but eventually Australia developed more inclusive institutions, partly because of the demands of the convicts who were sent there.
Wait, so the convicts helped make Australia more inclusive?
It might sound weird, but that's what they say. These convicts, even though they were criminals, they wanted a more fair and just society. They demanded things like property rights, legal protections, and a say in government. And these demands, along with other things, helped shape Australia.
That's really interesting. It shows that even in unexpected places, the push for inclusive institutions can happen. But I imagine overcoming the effects of colonialism and slavery is a huge challenge.
It is, and why nations fail doesn't have simple answers, but it gives us a way to understand why poverty and inequality are so deep-rooted in many parts of the world.
It seems like these historical patterns are still shaping the world today.
Absolutely. And in the last part of our deep dive, we'll look at how why nations fail helps us make sense of things like corruption, foreign aid, and the struggle to get out of these extractive systems.
So it's really interesting to see these patterns, inclusive extractive institutions playing out across history in different countries. It really makes you think about the world today.
Yeah, and why nations fail doesn't shy away from that. The authors tackle these tough issues: corruption, foreign aid, the struggle to escape those cycles of extraction.
Okay, so let's start with corruption. How do they connect that to this whole idea of inclusive versus extractive?
Well, they say corruption is both a symptom and a cause of those extractive systems. When you have a lot of power in the hands of a few and no accountability, it's easy for them to enrich themselves, at the expense of everyone else.
Right. It's like a vicious cycle. Corruption just creates more corruption, and that undermines development.
Exactly. And they point out that it's not just a developing country problem. It can happen anywhere when institutions are weak or designed to let those in power get away with things.
Okay, what about foreign aid? That's always a hot topic. What do they think about that?
They're actually pretty critical of how it's often used. They argue that sometimes it can do more harm than good, especially if it's just propping up corrupt regimes or reinforcing those power structures.
So it's not just about throwing money at the problem. It's about making sure that aid is actually helping to build inclusive institutions.
Exactly. It's about creating the conditions for real progress, not just a temporary fix.
That makes sense. And what about things like encouraging innovation and entrepreneurship? Is that part of it?
Yeah, they see that as really important for growth and social mobility.
What about China? They've had amazing growth, but they're still authoritarian. How does that fit in?
That's one of the most interesting parts of the book. They acknowledge China's success, but they say it might not last without more inclusive political institutions.
No, economic growth alone isn't enough. It's the kind of growth that matters.
Exactly. They point to the Soviet Union. They had fast growth under authoritarian rule, too. But eventually it all fell apart because there was no innovation, no individual initiative.
So they're saying there are some potential dangers with China's approach.
Yeah, they worry about elite capture, where those in power just use their positions to benefit themselves and stifle competition, which could lead to stagnation and instability.
It's a complicated situation, that's for sure. And the world's watching. But what about solutions? Does the book offer any guidance on how to break free from these extractive cycles?
Well, they don't have any easy answers or one-size-fits-all solutions, but they stress the importance of having a lot of different people working together for change.
You mean like citizens, activists, business leaders, even some people within the existing power structure who want reform?
Exactly. They look at things like the abolition of slavery, the expansion of voting rights, the civil rights movement. All of those involved a lot of different people coming together to challenge the way things were.
It's a reminder that change is possible, but it takes a lot of work and collaboration.
Yeah. And they talk about the role of leadership too.
Right.
Leaders who can show a vision for a more inclusive future, build trust, and figure out how to make these changes happen.
So it's not just about good ideas, it's about being able to actually put them into practice.
Absolutely. And they also talk about learning from history, both the successes and the failures.
I'm hearing a theme here. History isn't just something that happened in the past. It can teach us how to deal with the problems we have today.
That's a big part of why nations fail. It makes us think about the institutions that affect us, where they came from, and how we can be part of creating a better world.
I don't know about you, but I feel pretty inspired. It's a serious topic, but it's also hopeful. It reminds us that we can make a difference, even if it's slow and sometimes messy.
That's a great way to put it. It's about understanding the forces at play, seeing that change is possible, and working together.
And that's it for our deep dive into why nations fail. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking. And if you'd like to continue the conversation, head over to our website, leave a comment, share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you.
And that's a wrap for today's episode of BookerCast. We hope you enjoyed diving into it as much as we did. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. Your support means the world, and we can't wait to hear your thoughts on this episode.
Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and share this episode with your fellow book lovers. And let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you. See you in the next deep dive. Bye for now, and happy reading.